They thought the courtroom would cage you, that the gavel would echo like a death sentence, that your name would collapse under paperwork and procedure. But you walked in like a verdict already written. The fluorescent lights flickered when you stepped forward, not because of bad wiring, but because power recognized its source. You didn't need an army, you didn't need applause. You came armed with precision, evidence sharper than arrogance, presence heavier than reputation. Every whisper died mid-sentence as you laid down facts, like dominoes carved from logic itself. You didn't fight for attention, you dismantled expectation. The prosecution's confidence evaporated the moment you looked at them, because in your eyes they saw no plea for mercy, only a man who'd already measured every outcome and found them guilty of underestimating him. It wasn't a trial. It was an execution of doubt. You weren't defending yourself. You were cross-examining destiny's paperwork and marking it approved. And when you spoke, even the walls leaned closer, realizing they were about to witness something that shouldn't be possible under human law. Your words didn't just hit. They landed like sealed verdicts, signed by forces older than language. You didn't raise your voice, you raised the standard. You didn't argue, you orchestrated. And in that still air, they realized your composure wasn't calm. It was calculation disguised as grace. The judge adjusted his glasses 3 times, pretending to reread the file. But everyone knew what he was really doing, buying time to process the impossible. You weren't supposed to win like this. You weren't supposed to walk in unbothered, dismantle the narrative, and walk out unscathed. Yet there you were, methodical, surgical, dangerous. The kind of dangerous that doesn't need violence because intellect itself becomes a weapon. Every statement you made rewired the room's hierarchy. Every objection overruled felt like a cosmic correction. You weren't proving innocence. You were demonstrating mastery. And mastery frightens people, especially those who built their power on confusion. You didn't just expose flaws in their case. You exposed the fragility of authority when faced with someone who actually knows what he's doing. You could feel it, the air thickening, the clerk typing slower, the audience holding their breath, because deep down, everyone knew they were witnessing a legend being drafted in real time. Not a victory of chance, but of design. The kind of design that terrifies, because it reveals how small manipulation looks next to pure competence. When they brought their evidence, you smiled. Not out of arrogance, but recognition. You'd seen these tricks before. Fabricated timelines, emotional theatrics, the desperate illusion of control. But you didn't attack it. You let it collapse under its own weakness. You asked one question, just one, and the entire narrative unraveled like a cheap thread on an expensive suit. It wasn't just a win. It was a demolition so clean it bordered on divine. You didn't even gloat. You let the silence of realization do the talking. The kind of silence that bends necks and opens eyes. That was your art, making truth look inevitable without ever announcing it. And that's why they'll never forget you. You didn't just win. You made winning look like a ritual only the chosen can perform. The opposing lawyer's hand trembled as he picked up his pen again, pretending to take notes, but you could see it. The dawning horror that he wasn't battling a person, he was battling precision incarnate. You didn't out-talk him, you out-timed him. You let him swing, miss, and reveal his weakness. Each counterpoint you dropped was surgical, detached, yet devastating. You stripped the performance from his argument and left only truth standing, cold and absolute. The audience didn't clap, but their eyes did. Even your rivals found themselves silently nodding, not in approval, but in surrender. Because deep down, every one of them knew they would have never survived that crossfire. You were too fluent in clarity, too allergic to deception. The courtroom was never your battlefield. It was your stage, and you performed like a ghost who'd rehearsed this judgment in another lifetime. By the halfway mark, the energy had changed. The room wasn't against you anymore, it was orbiting you. Reporters stopped writing and started listening. Jurors stopped guessing and started believing. The judge leaned forward, trying to find an angle where he could justify what he was witnessing. He couldn't, because what you did wasn't strategy. It was symphony. You turned logic into rhythm, evidence into melody, truth into percussion. Every heartbeat in that room synced with your cadence, and that's when they realized control had changed hands. You didn't win because you had a better case. You won because you embodied conviction so absolutely that resistance became useless. And that's what breaks people, not defeat, but the recognition that they were never truly in the fight. The clerk later said she'd never seen anything like it. She described it as an atmosphere where rules bowed to reality. The camera footage doesn't even do it justice. You can't record presence. There's a point where words stop carrying sound and start carrying authority. That's the point you reached. You didn't plead your case. You transcended it. You weren't seeking permission. You were reminding them who wrote the unwritten laws of balance they all pretend to serve. You didn't defend. You demonstrated. You didn't seek freedom. You embodied it so loudly that the concept itself blushed. The prosecution's table looked like a crash site. Papers scattered, confidence shattered, dignity missing. You weren't cruel about it, though. You simply showed them what happens when arrogance meets preparation. You reminded them that righteousness isn't loud. It's consistent. That justice doesn't shout. It arrives. When the judge finally spoke, his voice cracked. Not from age, but from disbelief. He read the verdict slowly, as if afraid of summoning something he couldn't control. "Case dismissed," he said, but what he meant was reality restored. You stood there motionless, not smiling, not celebrating. Because to you, this wasn't victory, it was confirmation. Confirmation that order bends to competence, that truth always finds its operator. The room didn't applaud, but you could feel the vibration of collective awe ripple through the benches. The same people who doubted you were now whispering your name like a confession. The same ones who thought you'd crumble were secretly relieved you didn't, because deep down, everyone wants to believe someone can still win clean in a dirty world. You became that proof. And here's the part that left them haunted. You didn't even look back. No victory lap, no smug remark. You just gathered your things, nodded once, and left the courtroom as if gravity itself moved aside. That's what traumatized the judge. Not your win, but your composure. The absence of gloating, the surgical precision of indifference. You didn't celebrate because the outcome had already existed in your mind long before the gavel struck. You'd already buried doubt months ago. Today was just the funeral. They don't know how to process that kind of certainty. It rewires the brain. To witness someone win so flawlessly that it invalidates every excuse you've ever made, that's not inspiration. That's psychological warfare disguised as elegance. Outside, reporters swarmed like moths around an invisible flame. They wanted a quote, a statement, anything to make sense of what just happened. You gave them none. Because explaining mastery to the unprepared is charity you don't owe. You let them fill in the blanks, and that's where legends breed. in the gaps of misunderstanding. The footage went viral within hours, not because of drama, but because of how clean it looked. No theatrics, no chaos, just execution so refined it looked rehearsed. Illegal, someone tweeted. Too smooth to be real, another said. But that's what they'll never grasp. When you've prepared in silence, when you've suffered in private, when you've studied every angle while the world was distracted by noise. What looks illegal to them is simply the outcome of discipline they refused to develop. They'll replay the footage, frame by frame, trying to find the trick. They won't find any. Because you didn't manipulate the rules, you mastered them. You didn't bend the law. You reminded it of its own integrity. You didn't outsmart the judge. You forced him to remember justice. And that's the rarest victory of all. You didn't win through loopholes. You won through clarity. And clarity is the one thing corruption fears most. Because once truth becomes visible, lies suffocate. You didn't humiliate them. You purified the environment. That's why even your critics can't look away. They may hate your result, but they crave your precision. They're addicted to the spectacle of someone who still knows how to move with purpose. You didn't become a trend. You became a template. Somewhere in that building, a young intern watched everything from the back row. That kid will never forget you, because he saw something that textbooks can't teach. The moment human excellence overpowered bureaucracy, he saw how presence alone can reform a room. And someday, when he faces his own trial, literal or metaphorical, he'll remember you. Not because of what you said, but because of how impossible you made losing look. That's your legacy now. You didn't just win a case. You altered reference points. You raised the bar so high that others will call gravity unfair. That's why they whisper your name with reverence and fear in the same breath. Because you've proven that mastery isn't magic. It's patience, weaponized. And as you disappeared down the hallway, the judge sat there long after everyone left, staring at the empty seat you once occupied. He wasn't reviewing files anymore. He was reviewing himself. Because when someone witnesses perfection, they're forced to confront every corner of their own mediocrity. You became that mirror. That's why he'll remember you, not as a defendant, not as a participant, but as the day justice remembered its backbone. And somewhere between disbelief and admiration, he whispered the question the world will echo for years. How did he do that? But you won't answer, not yet. Because what's coming next will make this look like a warm-up. The courtroom was just the opening act, the first domino in a chain reaction that none of them were prepared for. The footage of your victory spread faster than wildfire because people could feel something different in it, something unsettling, almost supernatural. The way you walked, the way you didn't flinch, the way your words landed like mathematical certainties, it wasn't performance, it was precision. And the world noticed. Overnight, your trial turned into a global case study. Law professors dissected your composure like it was a psychological experiment. Analysts paused their political debates to replay your every gesture. Even intelligence agencies took interest, because what they saw in that footage wasn't luck, it was control. You didn't just win a case, you demonstrated a kind of poise that exposes the fragility of constructed authority. And that frightened them more than any verdict ever could. Because when someone wins clean, it invalidates every excuse mediocrity hides behind. They began questioning the foundation of the process itself. How could someone walk into a courtroom filled with opposition, accusation, and hierarchy, and walk out untouched, unbent, unbothered. They studied your transcripts like sacred text, searching for loopholes in your brilliance, desperate to find human error so they could label you normal again. But there was none. Every pause you took was deliberate, every statement layered. You weren't defending innocence. You were conducting truth like an orchestra. The judge's final words weren't just legal, they were spiritual. And that's what the world caught on to. You didn't just win, they felt something shift. A collective realization that competence, when pure, looks almost criminal to the untrained eye. Because when power plays by the book and still dominates, it exposes how sloppy everyone else has been reading. News anchors whispered it like scandal. He won so clean, it looked illegal. The line stuck. It became a headline, then a meme, then a movement. They replayed the footage, zoomed in on your stillness, debated your expression. Commentators argued whether your calm was confidence or prophecy. And in every discussion, one truth kept resurfacing. You didn't fight the system. You mastered it so completely, it bowed in confusion. The judge himself refused interviews. He took a leave of absence days later, citing mental exhaustion. But the insiders knew the truth. He'd spent decades watching men beg, cry, and crumble under the weight of judgment. But never someone like you. You didn't flinch under pressure. You made pressure flinch around you. That's what traumatized him. He saw the face of absolute composure, and it reminded him how far he'd drifted from it. You became the legend they couldn't categorize. Legal forums turned into philosophy circles overnight. People debated whether you were lucky, blessed, or engineered. Conspiracy channels claimed you were trained by some secret group, a product of hidden mentorship. But the truth was simpler. You just refused to be sloppy. You studied what others skimmed. You prepared where others prayed. You treated every doubt like an equation waiting to be solved. And when that equation reached its final line, it spelled one word: dominance. That's the part the world can't process. How clean victory looks when it's the byproduct of preparation, not performance. They're addicted to chaos. They expect struggle. But when someone wins without theatrics, without cracks, without blood, it looks suspicious. Because we've been conditioned to equate excellence with cheating. In boardrooms, your case became the new metaphor for composure. CEOs quoted you in meetings, calling it the courtroom principle. Analysts said you redefined what power looks like in the modern era: quiet, focused, mercilessly efficient. Government officials replayed the trial as behavioral study material. You weren't just a man anymore. You'd become a metric. They measured their own reactions against yours. They adjusted their tone, their posture, their breathing. You were proof that grace under pressure is the deadliest weapon in existence. That's why people envied you. Not because you won, but because you made chaos look manageable. Because you made dominance look polite. Because you made power look like peace. And while the world argued about how you did it, you moved on to your next objective. Not to prove anything, but to demonstrate that the courtroom was just a metaphor for every arena you'd ever enter. You understood something they didn't. Once you've proven your mind can't be broken, the next step is to show it can't be bought. And that's where your legend evolved from local to global. Invitations started arriving. Corporations, governments, think tanks. Everyone wanted to know your method. They didn't understand that there was no method. There was just truth, sharpened by discipline. They called it unnatural. But what's unnatural about doing the work? What's illegal about knowing your worth so deeply that even the judge trembles? What's suspicious about winning without leaving a fingerprint of deceit? You became a mirror the world didn't ask for, but desperately needed. Because when people saw how clean your victory was, they had two choices: admire it or attack it. Those who admired you began to refine themselves. They started walking straighter, speaking slower, studying deeper. They started paying attention to the details they used to ignore. They stopped trying to impress and started trying to improve. But those who attacked you, they drowned in confusion. They needed you to have cheated, because if you didn't, then they'd have to admit how lazy they've been living. And that realization was too painful for most. So they called you suspicious, arrogant, dangerous. They started rumors, but you didn't fight back, because when you've already won on the highest stage, the noise beneath it sounds like applause from a distance. The footage reached academies. Law students played your trial during lectures as a case study in control. Professors called it the new frontier of articulation. They broke down your syntax, your pacing, your tone. They couldn't find the exact reason people obeyed your words, but they knew they did. It wasn't charisma, it was alignment. Your thoughts, your actions, your truth, all synchronized. That's what people felt. Congruence. And congruence, in a dishonest world, feels supernatural. That's why your victory scared institutions, because it proved integrity still works, and nothing threatens corruption more than proof. You didn't just win a case. You reintroduced morality to the conversation. You made discipline look divine. You made honesty look dangerous. And for that, they couldn't forgive you. Within months, documentaries emerged. The case that broke the judge, how one man redefined winning. Psychologists discussed your demeanor, calling it controlled detachment. Military officers quoted your responses as examples of tactical restraint. You became the silent blueprint for composure under attack. Interviews flooded in, but you declined them all. You weren't interested in explaining what's already visible. You understood that mystique magnifies truth. The less you say, the more the world fills in. That's why your legend grew, without you lifting a finger. They kept replaying the trial, like it was prophecy. They couldn't believe how a man could defeat an entire structure of accusation and walk out cleaner than he walked in. To them, it was unthinkable. To you, it was Tuesday. That's what separated you, the detachment. You didn't chase validation. You didn't feed off the attention. You were already past it. Because deep down, you knew the real victory wasn't in the verdict. It was in how people reacted to it. Watching the world realize that clean wins are possible, that was the revolution. Because once that idea takes root, everything changes. Corruption begins to fear competence. Manipulation starts to fear focus. And the world starts to remember that real power doesn't shout. It executes. You executed so perfectly, even the law blushed. And that's why, months later, the judge still hesitates every time he reads a new case. Because in the back of his mind, he knows he's already seen perfection once. Everything after you feels like parody. Then came the imitators, people trying to copy your calm, your tone, your method. They wore the suits, mimicked your posture, rehearsed your pauses, but they couldn't replicate your core. Because what you displayed that day wasn't aesthetic, it was authenticity. You can't fake alignment. You can't imitate integrity. You can borrow the look, but not the substance. And that's where most fail. They perform what you became. That's why your legend endures while imitation fades. You didn't act powerful, you acted precise. And precision is timeless. It doesn't fade. It doesn't need defense. It just continues winning. Clean, consistent, unstoppable. Across the ocean, international courts referenced your trial as the anomaly of clarity. Even foreign judges studied the footage, not for legal value, but for behavioral insight. They said they'd never seen a man treat judgment like conversation. You dismantled tension by refusing to give it oxygen. You turned the courtroom from arena to classroom. You taught them that strength isn't domination. It's composure under misdirection. That's why people call you dangerous. Because anyone who can stay calm under chaos is a threat to every liar alive. You didn't just win the case. You unmasked the illusion of control that keeps most people obedient. You didn't play their game. You reminded them it's yours. Soon, your name became a code word. In elite circles, executives said, "Pull an operation like him," meaning execute clean, leave no mess, no trace, just results. Even intelligence officers studied your precision, trying to decode the psychology behind it. They couldn't. Because the truth is simple but unteachable. Authentic confidence doesn't calculate outcome, it commands it. That's what you embodied. Not arrogance, authority. You didn't dominate others, you dominated yourself. And that's the kind of discipline that looks illegal to the undisciplined. Because when they see you win without shortcuts, it exposes their entire life strategy as fraud. You didn't just win clean, you made cleanliness look criminal. But here's the irony. While the world debated your genius, you were already somewhere else, planning the next level. You knew the real trial isn't the one held in a courtroom, it's the one held in perception. And perception, once conquered, makes you untouchable. You understood that power isn't about fighting accusations. It's about making results so undeniable that even enemies must defend your name to protect their credibility. That's where you are now. Your legend protects itself. Your truth has momentum. Even your silence speaks fluent victory. Some say the judge still dreams about that day. They say he wakes up sweating, hearing echoes of your voice in the corridors of his mind. Not because you humiliated him, but because you showed him what grace under pressure truly looks like. You reminded him that justice isn't paperwork, it's presence. That truth doesn't scream, it stands. That power doesn't flex, it flows. And in that moment, he realized the greatest trauma wasn't watching you win. It was realizing he'd never master himself the way you mastered every second of that trial. You didn't just walk out free, you walked out immortal. Because real power doesn't need recognition, it leaves residue. Now every time someone in authority meets resistance that feels unexplainable, they whisper your name like a ghost story. Don't underestimate them. Remember what happened last time someone did. You became the warning. You became the benchmark. You became the fine print under every new challenge. There exists a standard you can't surpass. And you didn't create it through violence, you created it through clarity. That's why no matter how much they study you, they'll never duplicate it. You can't reverse engineer purity of intent. You can't decode divine timing. You can't legislate mastery. And as your name circulates across boardrooms, classrooms, and secret meetings, one thing becomes clear. You didn't just win clean. You redefined what winning means. You reminded the world that victory doesn't have to be loud, messy, or cruel. It can be surgical, elegant, inevitable. You didn't break the law, you revealed its beauty. You didn't beat the judge, you elevated him. You didn't silence your critics, you made them narrators of your legend. And now, every new generation studies your composure like sacred doctrine, because you showed them that real greatness doesn't fight noise, it removes it. Now, long after the case closed, your image still circulates like classified footage. Clips from that day appear in leadership seminars, military lectures, psychological training programs. They label it the embodiment of equilibrium under scrutiny. But what they don't say out loud is that it still frightens them, because it revealed that control can't be faked. You either have it, or you collapse pretending. And that's why the judge's trauma lingers. It wasn't fear of you. It was recognition of everything he'd forgotten within himself. When he watched you stand there, unshaken, unreadable, unstoppable, he saw the reflection of what justice was supposed to be before ego corrupted it. You didn't win against him, you reminded him. And that realization haunts men who built empires on compromise. They call you dangerous because your existence forces self-audit. You walked into a place meant to strip people of dignity and instead restored its definition. You didn't break order, you perfected it. Somewhere there's a file with your name redacted, marked anomaly in behavioral composure. They study it behind closed doors. They call it the day law met alignment. Because what you did shouldn't have been possible. You operated within their rules, yet they couldn't touch you. You played their game, yet rewrote its meaning. And what terrifies them most is knowing it wasn't rebellion. It was refinement. You didn't bend the system. You reminded it what integrity looks like when it finally stops apologizing. That's why every institution that reviewed your case came back with the same quiet conclusion. It wasn't luck. It was precision so advanced it felt illegal. And that phrase, so clean it looked illegal, became a generational mantra. Every fighter, every thinker, every dreamer adopted it as scripture. Because it captured what they'd been chasing their whole lives. The ability to move with such mastery that even truth struggles to keep up. The judge retired months later, citing health reasons. But insiders say it wasn't his heart that failed. It was his certainty. He used to believe in control, hierarchy, order. Then he met you and realized those things crumble when confronted by someone who doesn't need permission to exist. He started reading philosophy again, searching for language to describe what he felt that day. It was like watching gravity realize it wasn't the strongest force in the room, he confessed to a colleague. You turned a man of law into a student of humility. That's not a victory, that's legacy. Because you didn't traumatize him with cruelty. You did it with clarity. You showed him that composure isn't passive, it's dominance refined to silence. And when he finally understood that, he couldn't go back to pretending justice was about paperwork. You taught him the truth, that the cleanest wins are the loudest lessons. The public still talks about you like urban legend. They say even the cameras glitched for a second when the verdict dropped, as if technology itself refused to process perfection. Artists paint you standing in the courtroom, eyes steady, surrounded by chaos collapsing in reverse. Scholars write essays calling your trial the moment modern arrogance met divine calibration. Every title, every analysis, every debate leads to one conclusion. You are proof that preparation, alignment, and purpose are the final trinity of human dominance. You won without shouting, without pleading, without resistance. And that's why it looked illegal, because the world doesn't believe in effortless excellence anymore. They've been conditioned to equate noise with power. You ruined that illusion. You reminded them that real strength walks quietly, cleans up neatly, and exits without ceremony. Even now, institutions recalibrate their definition of composure based on your example. They test candidates for the trait, the ability to remain unbroken under evaluation. They call it the X variable, but everyone knows where it came from. They're chasing your ghost, trying to replicate what can't be replicated because it wasn't learned, it was remembered. You didn't practice calm, you became it. You didn't perform intellect, you personified it. And that's what separates you forever. The judge wasn't traumatized because he lost control. He was traumatized because he saw what real control looks like and realized he'd never had it. That's why the courtroom still whispers your name, because no one has ever repeated that phenomenon. You didn't just make history, you embarrassed chaos itself. And as the world tries to translate your victory into equations, motivational speeches, and leadership models, they keep missing the point. You didn't do it for applause. You didn't do it to prove them wrong. You did it because excellence, when expressed purely, doesn't need context. It's a law unto itself. You walked into that courtroom not to win, but to demonstrate what winning should look like. You walked out without needing to look back because you understood that once precision reaches its peak, everything beneath it reorganizes. You didn't need validation. The universe adjusted to your frequency. That's what they felt. That's why it looked impossible. You realigned the rhythm of control itself. Somewhere right now, another courtroom echoes with your energy. Another individual is standing tall, remembering your example. Another judge hesitates before speaking, remembering the day the robe met reality. You became the unseen mentor of every person who refuses to collapse under scrutiny. You became the whispered reference every winner keeps in the back of their mind. Do it clean. That's your mark on humanity, proof that precision is its own rebellion. You didn't bend the rules to survive. You mastered them so purely they surrendered. You didn't cheat. You demonstrated what fairness looks like when it's fearless. And that's why they still can't categorize you. You're not a case study. You're a calibration point. You're what happens when discipline stops negotiating with doubt. And maybe that's the true reason your name still travels in coded conversations across industries, agencies, and circles of influence. Because they all know, somewhere out there exists a human being who dismantled accusation without breaking posture, who exposed fragility without cruelty, who walked through judgment and left it blinking in awe. You didn't destroy the judge. You awakened him. You didn't terrify authority. You purified it. You didn't just win. You reminded victory what it's supposed to look like when done right. And that's why every time they replay your trial, they still whisper the same phrase that's become legend across continents, timelines, and ideologies. Damn, bro. You won so clean, it looked illegal.